Communities are all of the different species living in a certain area at a certain time. To move up the hierarchy of ecological organization to ecosystems, you have to consider abiotic factors as well. Video 4.4 is about one of those abiotic factors in ecosystems, energy. Video 4.4 will cover these 4 important learning targets. Press pause for a closer look. An ecosystem is all of the organisms plus the abiotic or non-living factors in an area. 2 huge abiotic factors that ecosystem ecologists study are energy and nutrients. So, big questions for us to consider in ecosystem ecology include how do nutrients and energy move throughout the ecosystem? A big thing to remember here is that energy flows and nutrients cycle. Here's a diagram to help show that. The main source of energy for life on Earth is the sun. Plants capture energy from the sun by doing photosynthesis. The sun's energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of glucose, the food that plants make with photosynthesis. And then when organisms eat plants, the energy in glucose is transferred to that organism. Then when organisms eat each other, the energy is transferred from one organism to another. And along the way, a lot of the energy is given off as heat. Now, energy flows because once the energy is lost as heat, the energy leaves the system and isn't recaptured by the system. Nutrients, on the other hand, cycle. When we mean nutrients, we're talking about things like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. And nutrient cycles will be covered in upcoming videos, so I don't want to go into depth right now. To study and describe energy flow, there's a lot of terms that we need to get comfortable with. The first term is trophic level. An organism's trophic level is the role that organism has in the food chain. I think you'll get the hang of it once you see some examples. At the bottom of the food chain are organisms with the trophic level of autotrophs. Autotrophs' role in the food chain is to make glucose from sun's energy during photosynthesis. Another name for autotrophs is producers. Now, the auto part of autotrophs refers to the fact that autotrophs feed themselves by producing their own food. So it's kind of like how autobiography is a book that someone writes about themselves. On land, plants are autotrophs. And in aquatic ecosystems, algae, cyanobacteria, and phytoplankton all fill the role of autotrophs or producers. The opposite of an autotroph is a heterotroph. Heterotrophs are also called consumers. Now, heterotrophs can't make their own food, and heterotrophs have to eat other organisms as a source of energy and nutrients. Heterotrophs are divided up into more layers based on what they eat. Primary consumers are heterotrophs that eat producers for food. In other words, primary consumers are herbivores. Secondary consumers, like this mouse right here, are heterotrophs that eat primary consumers for food. Tertiary consumers are heterotrophs that eat secondary consumers for food, like this hawk eats these mice. And this pattern can go on, with quaternary consumers eating tertiary consumers, fifth-level consumers eating fourth-level consumers, and so on. One point to remember is that all consumer levels, secondary consumers and up, are carnivores. And if you've heard of carnivores and herbivores, you've probably heard of omnivores. Omnivores are consumers that eat a mixture of producers and consumers by filling multiple trophic levels. When an omnivore eats plants, the omnivore acts as a primary consumer. When an omnivore eats another consumer, then the omnivore is acting as a secondary consumer or a higher level consumer. Last, but certainly not least, are the detritivores, which are also called decomposers. Decomposers eat waste from all organisms of all trophic levels, and also when organisms die or their parts die and fall off, the decomposers eat that too. Now, Detritivores play a huge role in the ecosystem as nutrient recyclers. Often, decomposers put nutrients back into the soil or back into the atmosphere so that producers then can bring the nutrients back into the food chain. It's important to note that although decomposers can recycle nutrients, they can't recycle energy. Now remember, that's because nutrients cycle and energy flows. Eating relationships in ecosystems are usually very complex, and so far we've used a food chain as an example, but ecosystems have many food chains existing simultaneously. A food web shows the relationships of all of the food chains combined, like this marine food web right here. Now, remember, in a food web or in a food chain, arrows show the direction of energy flow. So the energy of this krill flows into baleen whales when the whales eat the krill. When you're looking at a food web, you can anchor yourself by finding the producers. Producers only have arrows pointing away from them because producers aren't eating other things in the food web. Producers are making their own food. So in this food web, phytoplankton are the producers. Besides food webs, energy flow in ecosystems can be quantified using energy pyramids. An energy pyramid shows the amount of energy available in the standing crop of an ecosystem. And the standing crop is just everything that's alive to be eaten in a given place at a given time. In this example, the standing crop of producers has 10,000 joules of energy. The standing crop of grasshoppers has 1,000 joules of energy. The standing crop of mice has 100 joules, and the standing crop of snakes has 10 joules of energy. Instead of making energy pyramids, ecologists often measure biomass instead. Biomass is just the dry mass of the standing crop, and since the amount of energy is directly proportional to the dry mass, biomass pyramids and energy pyramids can essentially be thought of as pretty much interchangeable for our purposes. Another important concept is gross production and net production. Gross production is the amount of energy an organism takes in. An organism takes in its energy by eating. The way I remember that is, depending on who you hang out with, eating can be kind of gross, but still kind of cute, right? Now, net production is the energy that's stored in an organism and available for the next trophic level. Most energy is lost as heat or used for the organism to live, but the net energy is what's used to build biomass and make the organism bigger. The way I remember net productivity is thinking about how most energy passes through, but the net energy is what stays inside of the organism, just like these fish staying inside the fishing net. So I want to emphasize those key points of the last couple slides. So the gross energy is the energy taken in by eating. Now, some of the gross energy is used for life processes and maintaining the organism. Some of the gross energy is lost as waste, especially heat, and what's left over is net energy, which is used to make more biomass. Here's a diagram to drive the point home. This beetle gets its gross energy by eating the leaf. About 1/3 of that energy is used for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration makes ATP to do all of these functions essential for life. About half of the gross energy is lost as waste, poop, or heat. And then the remaining 17% of the energy that's left for growth, that's the net energy. This energy is the energy available for anything that eats the beetle. The ratio of net energy to gross energy is also called ecological efficiency. As shown here, ecological efficiency is the percentage of energy taken in that's transferred to the next trophic level, or the net energy divided by the gross energy times 100. To calculate ecological efficiency for grasshoppers, they eat 10,000 joules of plants, and they end up storing 1,000 joules of energy in their bodies. Net productivity is 1,000 joules, and gross productivity is 10,000 joules, so this gives us 10% ecological efficiency for grasshoppers. The mice would eat that 1,000 joules of grasshopper as their gross productivity and use that energy to make 100 joules of mouse biomass, giving us an ecological efficiency of 10% for mice. Snakes would eat the 100 joules of mice energy to make 10 joules of snake biomass, giving snakes an ecological efficiency of 10% as well. Are you seeing a pattern here? So the pattern is that ecological efficiency is usually around 10%, which led ecologists to come up with the 10% rule. The 10% rule states that only 10% of the energy that comes into a trophic level is transferred to the next trophic level. Energy transfer is really inefficient. That's because 90% of the energy is lost at each trophic level. So you can see how energy runs out really quick. This brings me to the last point of the video: primary production, or net primary productivity. Net primary productivity is the total amount of energy stored in plants. Plants do photosynthesis and store the sun's energy as glucose chemical energy. Then, this energy is available for the rest of the food web as the energy moves up the web. In other words, the NPP is the energy budget of the ecosystem. The higher the net primary productivity, the more levels can exist in the food web. So let's recap. We started this video with the definition of ecosystems. Ecosystems are made up of all of the biotic living things in an area, plus the abiotic non-living things. We're especially worried about energy and nutrients. Energy flows, and it flows from the sun into the food web and usually back out as heat. Organisms can be sorted in food webs based on trophic levels and how they acquire their energy. Energy in biomass pyramids show us that only about 10% of the energy an organism eats, its gross productivity, ends up being stored in an organism to be built as new biomass, its net productivity. And finally, the number of trophic levels in an ecosystem depends on the amount of energy in the plants, which is called the net primary productivity.